You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Happy Wednesday evening, folks. Welcome to my show. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com to come on over and see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. At the same time, you can come on over and watch the video simulcast over on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com, pardon me, /Mr. Scotty Roberts. And the best part, of course, of the video simulcast is the live chat room, which is going on right now, and you can join it live, or you can catch it in the rebroadcast. Come on over at any rate and check out all the archives, about 300 of them, of my former shows on the Odyssey Radio Network. So tonight, we're going to pick up talking about Joseph. And this we, of course, segued into Joseph off of talking about Moses, off of talking about the Exodus, talking about the magics of Egypt. And there's a lot of magics of Egypt that apply also into the Joseph story. But I think one of the most intriguing things about the Joseph story in the biblical text is setting the date and seeing the key phrases and the key sections of the passage in the biblical text, which establish, I think, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the dates and the period in which Joseph would have lived. Now, the Bible tells us that the Israelites dwelt in the land of Egypt for 430 years. Now, some people have interpreted that as 400 years of slavery. Well, I think perhaps from the time of Joseph arriving to the time of the Exodus, you have about that 400-year period. And we'll get into more breaking that down as we go. But we left off last night. Pardon me, I got a little, a little frog in my throat. There we go. I may have cleared it. And we left off talking about Joseph and his dreams. And these dreams he had as a young man. Remember, Joseph was the favorite son of their father, Jacob, whose name is also Israel, which is where we get Israel for the name of the family clan and eventually the nation. And it is Jacob who favors his highly favorite son by giving him this coat, what we've called the coat of many colors. It's a coat of honor, and it's a coat of, and we're going to see later tonight, by the way, I'm going to show you some pictures during this broadcast to show you some reconstructions of what they believe is a statue of Joseph in Egypt. And we'll talk more about that when we get there. But before we do that, let me show you something right now. We've been talking about the Asiatics. This is what the Egyptians called the peoples from the Middle East, from Canaan, from Syria, from above that, Asia Minor, Mesopotamia. All of these people that had come down and traveled through Israel and down through the Levant over the northern segment of the Sinai Peninsula and into Egypt. They came down and they resettled in the Nile Delta region. And that is that if you look at any map of Egypt, you're going to see the Nile River coming up from the south, and it empties into the Mediterranean, but down around the point of Cairo, it fans out, all these tributaries. And that whole region, that Nile Delta region, is lush and fertile. And it's not what you think of Egypt. I mean, Egypt, you've got dry and arid and desert, right? That's what we think of it. Well, up in the north, in the Nile Delta, you've got greenery, you've got humidity, you've got a very lush tropical setting. And so this is where people from the Middle East would come when there was like times of drought in the Middle East and other things that happened like that, or they just traveled, they visited, they wanted a better place to raise their crops, to raise their families, to raise, just like any of us do when we relocate. And for about 800 years, these Asiatics from the Middle East had come down into Egypt and settled in Egypt. And that over that 800 years, these people were known by Egyptian scribes as the Asiatics. This is the place they came from. And pardon me, as much as I tell my children, do not bother me while I'm doing radio, What have I got? My 5-year-old. What can I do for you? Yeah, but you could have waited till I was done with radio. Okay, so I'm going to hold this here, and you can have it when we're done with radio. Okay? Till I'm done, and that door opens. Same as usual. All right, folks. Sorry, being a dad there. My daughter just brought me, a little carton. It looks like a little milk carton from school that is Lost Kitties. It's little toys of some kind. And she wanted to know if she could open it. Of course, she did this while I'm doing the radio show. So it's totally lost on my kindergarten age girl. Oh, soon to be 6 in December. That it means when I'm doing radio, don't come in the room. Now, you've all seen this before, so there it is. So pardon that familial intrusion, and let's go on. We're talking about the Asiatics having settled for 800 years in Egypt, in the Nile Delta region. And they assimilated into the culture. They assimilated into the towns, the villages, the cities. And eventually they took over the northern kingdom. They took over the throne in northern Egypt, which is Lower Egypt. And that was the Hyksos period. They reigned for about 108 years. And I had pulled up here the exact dates of this. Let's see where I've got this. The Hyksos, first of all, Hyksos, by the way, the term is derived from the Greek, the Hyksos, and from the Egyptian expression, which is pronounced Hekau Kasut, Hekau Kasut, and that means Hekau Kasut, or Hyksos, means the rulers of foreign lands or from foreign lands. It was originally interpreted as the shepherding kings, and this is the rulers now from foreign lands. In a sense, I felt that there was a point in history where the scholars wanted to water down the shepherding aspect, water down the Israelite aspect, and so they modified that meaning a bit. They backed off of the shepherding part, and they went down to they're just the rulers. Instead of shepherding kings, they're the rulers from foreign lands. And it's a textual corruption of Hyksos. And Hyksos is simply a Greek version of the Egyptian title Heka Kasut, which means the rulers of foreign lands, the hill countries, the shepherding kings. And while much is understood, we know the Hyksos were comprised of this small group of Asiatic, West Asian individuals who ruled northern Egypt, especially the Delta, during the Second Intermediate Period between dynasties. And the Hyksos period would have been roughly 1650 to 1558 BCE. And they're called the Shepherd Kings from the Greek Hyksos. There you go. The H-I-Q, Shasu, the Hikshasu, the ruler of nomads, or Heka Kauswe, the chief of foreign lands. This is what they were called. So all these different variations on the words. And they ruled from 1650 to 1558 BCE. Now I've got the birth of Moses around 1526 BCE, thereabouts, by the biblical dating system. And that would have been under the reign of Tutmosis I. During his first year of his reign, Tutmosis I being the son of Ahmose I, who drove the Hyksos out at the end of this 108-year period. And so there's some interesting biblical references on that, but we're going to get to that and the interesting history of that in the course of how we lay out this story of Joseph. So what I want you to see here right now is these Hyksos, the Asiatics, who came into the land of Egypt around 1800 BC. And remember, they'd been coming for hundreds of years by the time you have the Hyksos period of monarchy, which was 1650. But they've been coming for hundreds of years prior to that. This is a picture of the Asiatics that you find painted on the tomb walls at Beni Hassan. Now take a look at this. It's a little rough, but here you go. Now here is, if you're watching this on the video, you can see that this is a old tomb painting, and what you see down the middle of this are the Asiatics, or those who are from Canaan, the Middle East. And you see how they're dressed, and you see their skin color. If you look way over to the right of this, in this middle column, you can see an Egyptian who is bringing the Canaanites into an audience with the Pharaoh. You see the color of his skin, he's darker red. Now you see over here the Middle Easterners, they're this yellow skin, and this is how the Egyptians color-coded the different races, so to speak. And so the Middle Easterners, those from Canaan, you can see they're yellow-skinned, they're painted here, and they also, you can see the types of clothing they're wearing. Now, what's very interesting, I'm going to show you a restoration. Well, before I do that, let me show you the women. If you look way off to the left of this, you see the donkey, and it's carrying little children, and then there's the women, the line of the women starting behind them. Here's what the Asiatic women looked like. Now, this is from that very same painting. You can see the tail of the donkey way over on the far right here. This is extended to the left of that original picture I showed you. This is a cleaned up, restored, the art was restored on the walls of the tomb. This is how the women from Canaan, the Middle Easterners, eventually the Israelites as well, this is how you would have seen them dress. These colorful patterns that were woven into their fabrics. And so they were, get out of your mind the idea of all these, everybody wore black robes or white robes and wandered around in the desert. No, this is the way they looked. This is how they dressed. If I take this down, look at the men again here. You see how the men, one shoulder exposed on some of them, the other one has both shoulders covered, the other one is shirtless, the one with the gazelle or the antelope or whatever that is. Then if you look again at this way off to the far left, you can see the woman. We zoom in on that, and this is what you see. And these are the kinds of clothes they wore. Now, I want to show you an artist's rendition of these same people. Now, this is an artist's rendition, copying verbatim what you see in these paintings. And here's what you've got. So right here, you see right in the dead center on the top, this is the leader of these Asiatics, of these Middle Easterners, these Canaanites, coming in, and he's got the gazelle. You see the next guy in line to the left is shirtless. Then you see the other guys, they've got the one sleeve uncovered. This is the bow arm. And so you see they're holding spears and weapons and swords and bows. They're presenting themselves to the Pharaoh. And then down below would have been what's extended to the left. You see the donkey with the two children. Then you see the young boy with a spear, and you see the women folk. And then you see more of the warriors coming behind them. He's got, one of them has a lyre, like what King David would have played, this type of lyre, although this is about 1,000 years before the time of David. And but you get an idea of what they looked like. And then you see the two Egyptians at the top. These are the men that are presenting the Canaanites, the Middle Easterners, to the Pharaoh. And there's some other interesting hieroglyphs there, which I haven't examined, but you see one with at the very top and very small. You see one who, Asiatic who is bound behind with his hands behind his back. I'm certain that these are a conquered people, but at the same time, this is also a people of the Asiatics that are moving into the Nile Delta region. And this painting is from about 1800 BCE. At the same time, on this same, very same cave paintings at Beni Hassan, tomb paintings, you see this image. These are the red-headed warriors that were Asiatics, that were coming along with this whole entourage from Canaan, presenting themselves to the Pharaoh. And they're migrants moving into the Nile Delta region, and this was part of their contingent. And what's very interesting is, and this is going to come up when we talk about Joseph, is the red hair and the red beards. These are the warriors, the fighters, the army, if you would, of the Canaanites that are coming in. Now, they're not coming in fighting the Egyptians. They're coming in as a people group moving in, and they're showing their weapons to show that they are warriors. Yes, they can fight for Egypt. Yes, they can, and so on. So here you have the red-headed Canaanite peoples, the Asiatics that are moving into the Nile Delta region. And all of these people would comprise the Hyksos, who eventually took over the northern kingdom of Egypt, after having been moving in and assimilating into the culture for roughly 800 years. So I thought that was interesting. And also what I did want you to see here and notice, which I don't think I mentioned, if you look at this again of the men and the women, we talked about the women's clothing. Look at the men's clothing. Let me show you this restored picture here. If you look at the men's clothing, look how brightly colored they are. Now, when we talk about Joseph having a coat or a cloak that his father made him of many colors, this gives you an indication of what some of that may have looked like. Because you see way off to the left on the top, you see some of these guys wearing white robes, or tunics, I guess you'd call them. Some of them wearing the brightly colored, some of them shirtless but wearing the kilt that's brightly colored. And so you get the idea. When we talk about Joseph having a coat of many colors, this gives you an idea of historically, culturally, what that may have looked like. Now, there's something very interesting. I want to show it to you right now, but I'd be jumping way ahead in the story, and it's kind of a reveal thing because it's exciting about Joseph. But I want you to keep in mind, look at the patterns on these people's clothing. And when we get to it, if we even get to it today, I hope we will by the end of the second segment, we'll get to it. I want you to take a note of this clothing, of what it looks like, and we'll make reference back to that a little later. Okay, so we had Joseph now. This is establishing who he was. I've just reestablished and recapped the Asiatics coming in and establishing their reign in Egypt. Their assimilation into Egyptian culture. And eventually the Hyksos were part of this people group that took over in the northern throne. And so let's go on in the story. We left off reading a bit about Joseph and the dreams that he had, and his brothers became very jealous of his dreams. And what did they do? Some of them said, let's just kill him. That's how jealous they were of him. I mean, what kind of family did they have that the older brothers wanted to kill the younger brother because he said, hey, I'm having dreams that you're going to bow to me? Now, this had something to do, there was something cultural about this. And when we can look a little bit at why these brothers felt the way they felt, and why they would have been so jealous of him. And over all the world, people hold the relationship between brothers in really high esteem. That relationship is considered a model for other forms of human interaction. The religious think of their fellow believers as brothers of faith, or sisters, if you will, when you get there. But we're talking about brothers here. The secular consider the relationship as the French Revolution's ideal of fraternity. And in the ancient Near East, things were really very much the same. The Babylonian and Assyrian letter writers, for example, regularly addressed each other in messages as brothers. And so did the great kings who wrote to each other in the famous Amarna letters about 1400 BCE. This is when Akhenaten, a couple of generations down from Pharaoh Amenhotep II, who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, Akhenaten was 3 or 4 generations down. And so about 50 years later in the ruling class. And so the most universal appreciation of brotherhood seems at odds, however, with the numerous stories that deal with hostile brothers' relationships and the violence that results from their mutual dislike. And there's examples are numerous, both in the Bible and elsewhere in literature and history. And the reason I want to look into this is because it really always set me aback. When you really think about it, you can listen to the story and go, okay, yeah, that's the story I'm being taught. But why did his brothers hate him so bad? In the Bible, remember, you got the story of Cain and Abel. Cain murders Abel. You've got the story of Jacob and Esau. And Jacob being Israel. And their hatred for each other. How Jacob steals the birthright from Esau. You've got Eteocles and Polynices and Romulus and Remus and Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland. And so the Franco-American scholar René Girard has observed that the close proximity that draws brothers together is, somewhat paradoxically, also what more than anything triggers deadly strife between the brothers. Brothers resemble each other with great regard to their physical and mental characteristics, but also with regard to the objects they desire, whether a woman, a throne, a father's estate. This mimetic desire, which can find fulfillment for one of them only, may easily lead to bloody conflict. And so one of the most famous narratives about hostile brothers is the biblical story of Joseph. And this was in Genesis 37 through 50 is where you find the story of Joseph. Joseph is the younger son of his father Jacob. He has 10 elder brothers, born from Jacob's first wife Leah and 2 slave women, and a younger brother Benjamin, all who, like Joseph, is the offspring of Jacob's younger wife Rachel. And the relationship between Joseph and his elder brothers is tense from the beginning, we're told. Jacob, who loved Joseph more than any of his children because he was the son of his old age, gives him a precious robe of honor. And when the elder brothers become aware of their father's partiality for Joseph, they begin to hate their younger sibling. They become even more incensed when Joseph then comes to them. And Joseph, I think, was not thinking very clearly, tells them of his 2 dreams that seem to suggest he's going to rule over them one day. And in the first dream, the sheaves bound by his brothers bow down to Joseph's sheaf. And in the second, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars prostrate themselves before him. And Jacob even scolds Joseph for that one, for his arrogant ambitions, but he kept the matter in mind, it says. He thought about it. He was very thoughtful about it. So later, Jacob sends Joseph to his brothers, or pasturing flocks at Dothan. This is what we read yesterday directly from the Old Testament scriptures. The brothers throw Joseph in a pit because they're so sick and tired of him. And they sell him to a merchant caravan headed for Egypt. And there Joseph experiences a series of highs and lows, the latter including a false accusation of rape by the wife of his employer, Potiphar, and a subsequent prison sentence. But after interpreting 2 dreams of the Pharaoh as indicating that 7 years of abundance will be followed by 7 years of want, and suggesting measures to cope with the impending crisis, Joseph becomes Pharaoh's second in command, his grand vizier. And sometime later, his family back in Israel, ravaged by famine, end up becoming a group of these Asiatics who move to Egypt. They go to the Nile Delta in order to find relief from the famine, not knowing Joseph is alive. It's been 20 years by this time. And so following several twists and turns, Joseph finally reveals to his father and brothers his true identity. And the narrative ends on a happy note. Jacob blesses his sons. Joseph forgives his brothers. But there's more to this. We got to go out to break. You guys sit tight. We'll be right back. Sitting on through that break. Welcome back to the show. This is Scotty Roberts. You're watching and listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com, where you can come on over and find all the goodness that's Odyssey Radio and all the different outlets where you can find this show in its audio format. You can also come over to my YouTube stream because right now we have a live chat room going there with the fellow Intrepids. And also, you get to see the video simulcast of this show. That's at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, we got a hell of a lot of material that we're going through here. This is one of my favorite things to do with Bible stories. I like to dissect them. I like to find out if there is historical accuracy, historical veracity, historical efficacy to the stories that we find in the Bible. And while the story of Joseph, there's a lot of scholars that think that it's probably not totally historically accurate, there is a lot of history within the text that rings very true. Some of the titles of the people, the names involved on the Egyptian side are historically accurate. When we start talking about the times when Joseph would have lived, some of the things he says as asides to his brothers later in the story are things that coincide with the history of the Hyksos, coincide with the history of the Pharaoh who ousted the Hyksos, the Egyptian Pharaoh from the south, and also the Pharaoh who had no regard for the memory of Joseph. And so we're going to go cover all of that. And I want to get back into the text a little bit and read a little bit more of this story directly from the Old Testament text. Now, yesterday we talked about Joseph, his dreams, his upbringing, the coat of many colors, and so on. And then how his brothers sold him into slavery. And they reported to their father, and their father went into mourning. They had taken the coat of many colors and shredded it up and dipped it in lamb's blood and presented it to their father, saying, "This is all we found. We never found Joseph's body." So the brothers know he's still alive, but you know what happens? Basically, before they see him again, 20 years pass. And so Joseph, in their mind, is gone forever. Now, it moves into a story in the Genesis narrative about one of the brothers and his episode with a prostitute and the bearing of a child and so on. We're going to skip over that. We're going to jump right back into the next chapter after that is the continuation of the Joseph story. Chapter 39 of Genesis reads like this. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Now wait a second. I want to get into a slightly different version. I like to read from a version of the Bible called The Message. Let's see if they've got this. There it is, in The Message. I like this because Eugene Peterson, who compiled The Message several years ago, took the Old Testament text, took the original texts as we know them, and interpreted it into more modern idiom and modern language. So let's read this from chapter 39. After Joseph had been taken to Egypt by the Ishmaelites, Potiphar, an Egyptian, one of Pharaoh's officials and the manager of his household, bought Joseph from them as a slave. As it turned out, God was with Joseph, and things went very well with him. He ended up living in the home of his Egyptian master. His master recognized that God was with him, saw that God was working for good in everything he did, and he became very fond of Joseph and made him his personal aide. He put him in charge of all his personal affairs, turning everything over to him. And from that moment on, God blessed the home of the Egyptian, all because of Joseph. The blessing of God spread over everything he owned at home and in the fields, and all Potiphar had to concern himself with was eating 3 meals a day. So this is the biblical passage. So Joseph is purchased by Potiphar, who is an Egyptian official. He places him, he sees Joseph as smart, he sees God is with Joseph. Now, does this mean he was a believer in Jehovah God? No, not necessarily. All this is stating is that he sees that Joseph is a guy who is endowed by the Creator with skills, and he favors him. He makes him the head of his household. Joseph becomes the chief steward of Potiphar's household, according to the biblical text. Now, there's no historical record of this. There is record of a Potiphar, and I got to see if I thought I opened that all up here and held on to that. Maybe I didn't. I had something in here about Potiphar. No, I don't. I did not leave it open. So, going back to the story, well, Potiphar was a recognized name. Potiphar, Potiphara, or Potipharah is found in the biblical texts. It's also found in other legends and other writings of the Jews, other stories of the Jews, other stories about the stories of the Jews. So, as it turned out, according to the biblical passage, Joseph was a strikingly handsome man, the Bible says. As time went on, his master's wife became infatuated with Joseph. Okay, here you go. You got Potiphar, who's bought this slave from Canaan, and he's elevated him to a position of, because he's got the smarts, he's got the looks, he's got the wherewithal, he sees gods, the gods are with him, he makes him his chief steward. And Joseph really runs his household very well as the chief steward. Now, we don't know how many years have passed or how long this has gone on. I think a relatively short period of time. But his wife, Potiphar's wife, and we don't know her name in Scripture. She's called, there is a name that she's called Zuleika, Zuleika, in Muslim literature, the Quran. And in other, even though the African wife of Potiphar, and they call her the African wife, because they think that she may have been not Nubian, but Somali, because of the borders of Egypt at the time, and there's other historical data I haven't gotten into for this. But she's called in a lot of these old stories the African wife of Potiphar, is nameless in the Old Testament. And Jewish literature gave her the name Zuleika. It was the medieval commentary Sefer HaYashar, in his commentary on the Torah, who gave her this name. She was filled with an invisible passion, quote unquote, for Joseph, who was a slave in the house of Potiphar, Potipharah, an idolatrous priest in Egypt, according to the Jewish writings. So, not only was a high official, Potipharah was found to be also a high priest in ancient records. Is it the same Potipharah? We're pretty sure it is. Now, she was filled with this passion for Joseph, and her longing to have a child through Joseph was heightened by the astrologic forecast that she was destined to have a descendant through Joseph, according to what has been read by the stars. Now, this is not found in the biblical text. This is the extra-biblical, the Jewish writings about these people. And unfortunately, she misunderstood that prediction, which was to be fulfilled in Joseph marrying her daughter, Asenath, and later on with many children. And so according to the legends of the Jews, since Zuleika did not have a son, she pretended she wanted to adopt Joseph as her son, and she was demonstrating her affection by going to Joseph at night and trying to persuade him to sleep with her. So when Joseph eventually knew her trick, he, according to this passages, the Jewish texts, he prayed to God to divert her attention from him. Now, going on in the biblical text, in the book of Genesis, we left off, Joseph was a strikingly handsome man. And as time went on, his master's wife became infatuated with him, and one day she said, "Sleep with me." According to the text now, it says he wouldn't do it. He said to his master's wife, "Look, with me here, my master doesn't give me a second thought to anything that goes on in his house. He's put me in charge of everything he owns. He treats me as an equal. The only thing he hasn't turned over to me is you." That's what he says to Mrs. Potiphar. "You're his wife, after all. How could I violate his trust and sin against my own God?" This is how he answers her, according to the Old Testament, the book of Genesis. But it goes on to say she pestered him every day after day after day. But he stood his ground. He refused to go to bed with her. Now, on one of these days, he came to the house to do his work, and none of the household servants happened to be there. The house is empty. What happens? Mrs. Potiphar grabs him by his cloak and says, "Sleep with me." In other words, take me now. The house is empty. And he left his coat in her hand and ran out of the house, is what this says. And when she realized that he'd left his cloak in her hand and run outside, she called to her house servants, "Look, this Hebrew shows up, and before you know it, he's trying to seduce us. He tried to make love to me, but I yelled out as loud as I could with all my yelling and screaming, and he left his coat beside me here and ran outside." And it says she kept his coat right there until his master, Potiphar, came home. She told Potiphar, her husband, the same story. She said, "The Hebrew slave, the one you brought to us, came after me and tried to use me for his plaything. When I yelled and screamed, he left his coat with me and ran outside." Now, before I go on with the biblical narrative here, let me go through something. When I was a youth pastor, I used to teach this story to the kids in my youth group. And I said to them, now remember, keep in context, when I was a youth pastor, we were teaching biblical principles, how to live a better life, how to live a good Christian life, a godly life, and so on. That was the kind of the foundation to the way we taught things. But I talked to these kids and I said, I had never heard it put this way before, and I said, do you think when Joseph left his coat in the hands of Mrs. Potiphar and ran, I said, do you think that she was tempting because, and pardon me for saying this way, but do you think she was tempting Joseph because she was an ugly, slothful, Jabba the Hutt, fat, greasy, ugly, stinky, smelly woman who wanted to have sex with him? No. That wouldn't have been a temptation. It says Joseph was tempted by her, and she kept nagging him to sleep with her. And then finally he leaves his coat in her hand and runs. Do you know why I think he ran? He probably ran because he knew that if he stuck around, he'd give in. As strong as he was, I think Mrs. Potiphar was probably a babe and a half. I think she was good looking. I think she was a younger woman. She wanted children. She thought she was following this astronomical thing, which is not in the scripture in Genesis. It's in extra Jewish writings about this story. And I think she was only tempting. How can you be tempted by something that is not desirable to you? Can you be tempted by something that you have no desire for? Would that tempt you? Would that make you go astray? No. What makes you go astray? It's the stuff that's desirable to you, but you know you shouldn't be doing. That's what temptation is. Now, there's if you will, a biblical teaching. There is a teaching for life. And I told the kids in my youth group, I said, Joseph probably ran because she was hot, and he knew if he stuck around, he'd give in. And so he runs. What does she do? She cries rape. I want you to think of current politics. Think of how many women in political scenarios over politicians cry rape. I think Mrs. Potiphar set a precedent 3,000 years ago and more, 3,500 years ago. I think she set a precedent that this is what can happen sometimes. Is that rape can be screamed, oh, okay, I can see it now. I'm going to get all kinds of letters. I'm not making a commentary on women who are raped, okay? I'm not saying that. But I am saying that in this case, this particular woman lied about it in order to cover her tracks. And we see a lot of this in politics today. Let's leave it at that before I get myself in trouble with women's groups who want to misquote me. But, so it says, she kept his coat. She told her husband He wanted to use me as his plaything, and when I yelled and screamed, he left his coat with me and ran outside. So when his master heard his wife's story, telling him, "These are the things your slave did to me," Potiphar was furious. Joseph's master took him and threw him into the jail where the king's prisoners were locked up. But there in jail, God was still with Joseph. He reached out in kindness to Joseph. He put him on good terms with the head jailer, and the head jailer put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners. And he ended up managing the whole operation. So here's Joseph, thrown in prison by Mr. Potiphar, who's pissed at him. And he throws him in prison, and the head of the jail finds that Joseph was the head steward for Potiphar. And he employs his talents as a prisoner, and Joseph ends up running the whole place. And so the head of the jailer put him in charge. The head jailer gave Joseph free rein, never even checked on him, because God was with him. This is from the passage in Genesis. Never even checked on Joseph because God was with Joseph. Whatever he did, God made sure it worked out for the best. And so this is what we see. This is the fate of Joseph. After he first gets to Egypt, he's sold as a slave, goes to Potiphar's house, and Potiphar's wife Potiphar raises him to his chief steward, takes care of everything in the household. Well, Potiphar's wife cries rape after she tries to seduce Joseph. When Joseph runs from her, Potiphar throws him in prison. And Joseph does such a fantastic job in prison that the head jailer takes him and knows what he did. He was Potiphar's chief steward. He probably gave Joseph some responsibilities, and Joseph shined, and he made him the chief of everything. He didn't even check on him anymore. Joseph ran the whole jail, according to the Genesis text. This is an Egyptian jail. Now, there's something I want to make comment on that you can read between the lines a little bit, but I want to tell you something. In ancient Egypt, at this time period, if an official like Potiphar, and if he was indeed a high priest, if a slave tried to rape his wife, what do you think was the consequence? It wasn't throwing him in jail. The consequence was execution. A slave didn't dare touch the wife of a high official, let alone try to commit a crime of rape. Even if it hadn't been rape, even if Joseph had seduced Mrs. Potiphar and was caught in the act, he would be executed. Mrs. Potiphar, I don't know what her fate exactly would have been, but if she had been caught having sex with Joseph, her fate would not have been good at all either. So, what can you surmise then by the fact that Potiphar, instead of executing Joseph, threw him in jail? He's probably like, I don't think I believe her story. This is my wife. I know her. Joseph was his friend, his chief steward, made his life easy. He's probably pissed off that he's got to lose his chief steward, and he probably doesn't believe Joseph's story at all. It says he just threw him in prison. I'm pretty sure Joseph had an audience with him, which the Bible doesn't record in the story. So I think Potiphar spared his life and threw him into jail because he knew Mrs. Potiphar was probably lying about the story. So now we have Joseph in jail, and we have Potiphar having thrown him there. So we move into chapter 40 of Genesis, and it says, as time went on, it happened that a cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt crossed their master, the king of Egypt, and Pharaoh was furious with his two officials, the head cupbearer and the head baker, and he put them in custody under the captain of the guard. It was the same jail where Joseph was held. Now keep in mind, Joseph's running the jail. So the captain of the guard assigned Joseph to see to their needs. Now, after they'd been in custody for a while, this is the biblical text, the king's cupbearer and baker, while being held in jail, both had a dream on the same night, and each dream having its own meaning. And when Joseph arrived in the morning, he noticed that they were feeling low. So he asked them, the two officials of Pharaoh, the cupbearer and the baker, who had been thrown in jail with him, "What's wrong? Why the long faces?" They're in jail. They're servants of the Pharaoh, and they're in jail. "What's with the long face?" Joseph says. And they said, "We dreamed dreams, and there's no one to interpret them." Joseph said, "Don't interpretations come from God? Tell me the dreams." And so first he heard the cupbearer, and he told his dream to Joseph. "In my dream, there was a vine in front of me with 3 branches on it. It budded, it blossomed, and the clusters ripened into grapes. I was holding Pharaoh's cup. I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup to Pharaoh." So Joseph, as it says in the text, he immediately interprets the dream. He goes, "Here's the meaning. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will get you out of here and put you back to your old work. You'll be giving Pharaoh his cup just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. Only do this. Remember me when things are going well with you again. Tell Pharaoh about me. Get me out of this hellhole. I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and since I've been here, I've done nothing to deserve being put in this hole." So when the head baker saw how well Joseph's interpretation turned out for the cupbearer, he spoke up. "My dream went like this," he said. "My dream was, I saw 3 wicker baskets on my head. The top basket had assorted pastries from the bakery, and birds were picking at them from the basket on my head." And Joseph said, "Here's the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days, and within 3 days, Pharaoh will take off your head, impale you on a post, and the birds will pick your bones clean." Whoo! Holy shit! What if somebody told you that about a dream you just had last night? So he's got the cupbearer is going to be restored, the baker is not. What did the baker do? I wish I knew exactly what the crimes were that these men had committed, that Pharaoh threw them in jail, and then he kills one of them. Sure enough, on the 3rd day, it was Pharaoh's birthday, and he threw a feast for all his servants. He set the head cupbearer and the head baker in places of honor in the presence of all the guests. Then he restored the head of the cupbearer to his cupbearing post. He handed Pharaoh his cup just as before, and then he impaled the head baker on a post, following Joseph's interpretations exactly. But the head cupbearer never gave Joseph another thought, and he forgot all about him. So this is the story in the book of Genesis. Joseph now in jail. He's the head of the jail for the head jailer. He's running the place. He doesn't even get checked on. He's got integrity, according to the story. He now magically interprets these dreams. Now Joseph the dreamer, the one who had dreamt back in Canaan of his brothers bowing to him, now is dreaming of, or is interpreting these dreams. So, dreams in the Joseph story, both those he dreamt himself and those he interpreted for others, have long mesmerized us as either people of faith who read these stories, or we've heard these stories. They've always, if you're Jewish, if you're Muslim, if you're Christian, you've heard these stories. You've grown up with them, and we've been mesmerized by them. His arrogant boasting, Joseph, of his dreams to his brothers, almost cost him his life. They almost killed him for his arrogance and his boasting. Who knows if he meant to do that, or if he was just a stupid teenager when he did that. So his gifts as a dream interpreter won him release from prison and slavery and allowed him to become a prince in Egypt. Now, we've jumped a little bit ahead of the story of Joseph in the narrative. So far, we see him still languishing in jail. Remember, he interpreted the cupbearer's dream, and he said, "Just one thing, remember me," to Pharaoh. And but the cupbearer forgot him. And it was a couple of years he forgot him. So Joseph languished in Pharaoh's dungeon for more than 2 years after Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him. When she failed, the spurned woman falsely claimed that Joseph, overseer of her husband's household, had come to dally with her. And Potiphar, Joseph's master and one of Pharaoh's chief officials, threw Joseph into prison. And there Joseph met Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and the chief baker, each of whom dreamed baffling dreams, which Joseph interpreted as we just read in the account. And Joseph correctly understood their dreams as portents of their fates. And so news of Joseph, after 2 years, news of his successful interpretation, finally reached Pharaoh through the cupbearer, and we'll see that as we read the text. As a matter of fact, in the text, if we go to chapter 41 now, in the book of Genesis, it says, 2 years passed, and Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile River. 7 cows came up out of the Nile, all shimmering with health, and grazed on the marsh grass. Then 7 other cows, all skin and bones, came up out of the river after them and stood by them on the bank of the Nile. The skinny cows ate the 7 healthy cows, and then Pharaoh woke up. He went back to sleep and dreamed a second time. 7 ears of grain, full-bodied and lush, grew out of a single stalk. Then 7 more ears grew up, but these were thin and dried out by the east wind. The thin ears swallowed up the full, healthy ears. Then Pharaoh woke up. Another dream. When morning came, he was upset. He sent for all the magicians and the sages of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but they couldn't interpret them to him. So here you go. You got the Pharaoh who's obviously being given dreams of precognition. And he calls all his magicians, and they can't interpret this for him. They don't know what to tell him. And so the head cupbearer in the passage then spoke up and said to Pharaoh, "I just now remembered something, my lord Pharaoh. I'm sorry, I should have told you this long ago. Once, when Pharaoh got angry with his servants, if you remember that, my Pharaoh, you locked me up and the head baker in the house of the captain of the guard. We both had dreams on the same night, each dream with its own meaning. It so happened that there was a young Hebrew slave there with us. He belonged to the captain of the guard, and we told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, each dream separately. Things turned out just as he interpreted. I was returned to my position, and the head baker was impaled. And Pharaoh at once sent for Joseph. They brought him on the run from the jail cell. He cut his hair, put on clean clothes, and came to the Pharaoh. So he must have gotten pretty scraggly while in prison. I dreamed a dream, Pharaoh told Joseph. Nobody can interpret it, but I've heard that just by hearing a dream you can interpret it. And Joseph answered the Pharaoh, and he said, "Not I, but God. God will set Pharaoh's mind at ease." Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "In my dream I was standing on the bank," and he recites his dreams to Joseph. The 2 dreams. And then he talks about the second dream. He says, I've told all of this to the magicians, but they can't figure it out. Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's 2 dreams both mean the same thing. God is telling Pharaoh that what he's going to do. The 7 healthy cows are 7 years, and the 7 healthy ears of grain are 7 years. They're the same dream. The 7 sick and ugly cows that followed them up are the 7 years, and the 7 scrawny ears of grain dried out by the east wind are the same, 7 years of famine. So you're going to have 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. The meaning is what I said earlier. God is letting Pharaoh in on what he's going to do. 7 years of plenty are on their way throughout Egypt. But on their heels are going to come 7 years of famine, leaving no trace of the Egyptian plenty. As the country is emptied by famine, there won't even be a scrap left of the previous plenty. The famine will be total. The fact that Pharaoh dreamt the same dream twice emphasizes God's determination to do this and do it soon. So Pharaoh needs to look for a wise and experienced man and put him in charge of the country. Then Pharaoh needs to appoint managers throughout the country of Egypt to organize it during the years of plenty. Their job will be to collect all the food produced in the good years and ahead, stockpile the grain under Pharaoh's authority, storing it in the towns for food. This grain will be held back to be used later during the 7 years of famine that are coming to Egypt. This way the country won't be devastated by famine. This seemed like a pretty good idea to Pharaoh and his officials. And the Pharaoh said to his officials, "Isn't this the man we need? Are we going to find anyone else who has God's Spirit in him like this?" So the Pharaoh said to Joseph, "You're the man. We're going to appoint you." And so that's where we've got to end for tonight. So now we've seen what's happened to Joseph in Egypt, at least according to the biblical text. We're going to examine this more closely and look into the history of all of this tomorrow. So 23-hour break and we'll be right back. You all sit tight. Thanks for being here tonight.